Okay, good. So this is going to be recorded, and hopefully we'll be able to put this up on YouTube if it goes well, if I remember, if I've done the settings right so that the sound is also recorded. Okay, so just a little bit of a brief disclaimer here. There is a difference between naturalism and atheism. So atheism is basically the viewpoint that no God exists. So this is the classical definition, or this is a specific belief that God does not exist. But of course, many today claim that atheism instead is the state of lacking belief in a God. So it says something more like about the psychological situation of the person. Oh, I just lack belief, rather than it's a positive statement being there is no God. And a lot of people will say, well, atheism is not a worldview, and I guess technically that's correct, because the worldview that is often entailed by atheists, or sorry, embraced by atheists, is something called naturalism. So there are atheists out there who are not naturalists, like a lot of Buddhism is some forms of Buddhism is atheistic, where they don't believe in God, but they do believe in like a soul or a spirit or whatever. But most atheists these days, especially the most vocal ones in this country, are naturalists. So they think, not only is there no God, but there's no such thing as the soul, there's no such thing as the spirit, there's no such thing as anything else but the natural world. Right? So naturalists would hold that there is only the laws of nature, there is no God. And basically, usually what this used to mean is just this universe exists. Right? So Carl Sagan's famous quote is that the cosmos is all that ever was, all that is, ever was, or ever will be. Right? But nowadays, a lot of times naturalists will include the multiverse, which goes beyond our universe, but they still say that the multiverse is natural. Okay, so the reason why I put that out there is because I used to say, well, these are the worldview implications of atheism, but really it's the worldview implications of naturalism. But what comes out of the idea that there is no God and that only nature exists are basic foundations of the worldview. For example, it has implications for where we came from, right? So, a lot of the questions that you might ask that are big questions of life are where did I come from? Who am I? Where am I going? What am I doing here? Etc. Right? So if there's no God, where did we come from? That means the universe is unplanned. It was an accident, right? The natural world is just a brute fact. There's no explanation for its existence. There's no reason that it exists. And the fine-tuning that we see in our world is defeated by something called the multiverse. Right, so the fine-tuning is an argument for the existence of God, but you know what? Since there are an infinite number of universes out there, or nearly infinite, then the fine-tuning is just an illusion. Okay, what about where we're going? Well, there's no meaning, hope, purpose, or destiny to this world, to this life, and there's no such thing as an afterlife. That's certainly true if there's no God. And who are we? What are we doing here, right? So there's no objective morality. There's no evil. There's no free will. There's no rationality. There are no thoughts. There are no grounds for belief, and there's no justice, right? So I could go on and on about this for a long time. A lot of the things that we cherish, that we think are true about us, are actually untrue if there is no God, right? On the worldview of naturalism, and so hopefully we'll get to at least a lot of those and unpack them. So before I go on, I couldn't help but to put this. Oh, sorry, these are all foundations of a worldview, right? So before I go on, I couldn't help but put this in here. So who in here has heard of the Reason Rally? Anybody? Nobody has heard of the Reason Rally. Okay, well, that's interesting. Well, in 2012, there was this thing called the Reason Rally, where a bunch of atheists gathered on the National Mall to celebrate reason. It's kind of like, they had speakers there, guest speakers like Richard Dawkins was there, and they talked about how important atheism was, and they wanted to celebrate reason, right? Because these folks are held up as a bastion of reason. And these stupid religious people, they don't have reason, they just have faith, right? So the irony of all this, in regard to the previous slide that I just showed you, is that these people, which also call themselves free thinkers, they say that reason is good, but the irony is they ascribe to a worldview that implies there's no free will, so how are they free thinkers? There is no thought, so how are they thinkers at all? There's no good, so how can they say reason is good? And there's also no reason. So it's really funny about that. But anyway, and also there's also a Reason Rally taking place this year. At least that's what I've heard. And one of the speakers at the Reason Rally is Johnny Depp, which, okay, good. So you bring in a celebrity to attract the crowds, but I wouldn't exactly hold an actor up as a bastion of reason. I don't know. I mean, maybe he is. Maybe he's like a scholar and has looked into these things pretty deeply. But a lot of times what I find is that when you have these popular level celebrities talking about theology or philosophy, they're like way off, right? So anyway, Not to bash Johnny Depp, I like him as an actor. Okay, another disclaimer. So these implications that I just showed you, that there's no reason, there's no thoughts, rationality, blah, 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 no free will, I'm not saying that any of these implications make naturalism false. They just simply, that's just the way they are, right? So if you were a naturalist, these are the actual implications that really you have to embrace about your worldview. But some of them are unpalatable, right? Some of them are not really all that cool, right? So a lot of people will have a really hard time agreeing with the notion that there's no free will, right? Because a lot of us, we experience our free will so strongly and powerfully, it's really hard to deny that, right? So some atheists, they bite the bullet and they say, you know what? There's no free will. And if you think there's free will, that's just an illusion, right? And others don't necessarily realize that that's an implication of naturalism. Some may have heard that it's an implication of naturalism, but they don't want to accept that. So they have this tension, right, where they still think they have free will, but they still think there's no God. It's kind of interesting, right? So, but maybe we should just accept it, right? Sorry, I didn't finish this bullet point, right? So just because they're unpalatable does not make naturalism false. In the same way, there are a lot of Christian doctrines that are unpalatable, or parts of the Bible that are unpalatable, like the slaughtering of the Canaanites, for example. That doesn't make it false, right? And in fact, some people say we should just accept these implications, right? So this is a quote from a famous atheist named Lawrence Krauss, who wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. And in it he says, if we wish to draw philosophical conclusions about our own existence, our significance, and the significance of the universe itself, our conclusions should be based on empirical knowledge. Okay, good, that's fine. A truly open mind means forcing our imaginations to conform to the evidence of reality and not vice versa, whether or not we like the implications. And so I hope, I'm sure what this guy had in mind when he wrote this was he had in mind saying, look, you Christians and other religious people out there, even though you have this imagination there's a God, the empirical evidence says there's not, and so you better be willing to accept that. But of course, it cuts both ways as well. So we should just accept some of these unpalatable implications, right? So I'm not saying that these make atheism false, but if you have an inconsistency in your worldview, if you know there's free will, if you know there's morality, if you know there's good and evil out in the world, and there's a worldview that says that there is no free will, there is no good, there's no evil, there's no morality, this should raise a red flag to you. This should say, hey, wait, you know what? Maybe this worldview isn't really true. Maybe I should re-examine whether or not naturalism is the right worldview to hold on to, right? And also a true worldview must be livable, right? So you have atheists that go around saying, well, there's no such thing as morality. But then they live as if there were morality. And if you try to live as if there were no morality, you just can't do it, right? So that's another reason, that's another red flag that should be raised if you're a naturalist. In addition to that claim, I'm also claiming, and we'll get to this at the end, or towards near the end, it's not lacking free will, it's not just unpalatable, but it actually really defeats naturalism. It makes it so there's no reason that you should ever believe that naturalism is true. And so anyone who thinks that there is no free will and holds to naturalism actually cannot hold on to it rationally. It's not a rational belief to hold. So we'll get to that at the end. By the way, I gave this talk largely exactly as it is now to a group of atheists. And they were like, yeah, I totally agree with everything you said here, except for they don't think that atheism/naturalism leads to a lack of rationality. So, maybe that's because people want to hold on to the idea that their worldview is based on rational thinking. And so they want to deny that part of it. Okay, so let's get into some of these big questions, right? So where did we come from, according to naturalism? And I'm going to kind of go through the first couple parts of this pretty quickly because this is a pretty long presentation, and the cool stuff actually is at the end, so I don't want to skip over that when we get to there. Okay, so the universe was not planned or designed, right? How could it be designed if there's no designer, right? In other words, the universe was an accident. So Lawrence Krauss and others suggest that the universe just came from nothing. It just came out of nowhere. In fact, that's the name of his book, A Universe from Nothing. Now, in his book, he says this, quote, he says, the amazing thing is that every atom in our body came from a star that exploded. Okay, that's amazing. All right, I guess it's cool, right? And atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than in your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if the stars hadn't exploded because the elements All the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They were created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they could get into your body is if those stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Great. Okay, and there's this little picture up in the upper right-hand corner, right, which says that 90% of your body mass is stardust because, hydrogen and helium didn't come from the stars. They actually were kind of there from near the beginning before the stars exploded. But 90% of your body mass came from stars. Okay, so how would you respond to this? And what do you think Krauss is implying by this quote here? So I want you guys. So what I want you to do, something that we do in here is called active discussion. So you guys talk about it. You guys talk about this question. You guys talk about this question. Maybe you groups of across the aisle here talk about the answer to this question. Okay, so how would you respond to this? What do you think Krauss is implying? Anyone want to volunteer? Yes.
I was asking where the stars came from.
Okay, you'd ask him where did the stars come from. That's a good one. Yeah, because he thinks the universe came up from nothing, right? So how do you explain that? Okay. Yeah, Ben.
I think this is seems as distracting.
It was what? Sorry, distracting?
Yeah, this raises absolutely no argument against Christianity. So what if God used stardust?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So what, right? It raises no argument against Christianity, which gets us to the second point. I think you guys all jumped to that. What do you think Krauss is implying? I think he's implying that because we all came from stardust, therefore God doesn't exist. Which is kind of a really weird jump there. But he's not the only one who made it. So if you look in the popular media at the time, so this is a quote from a website called popcrush.com, and I did not surf this myself. I stumbled upon this when I was looking for quotes from Lawrence Krauss, and I thought this was too juicy to pass up. So there is a person named Miley Cyrus. I don't know if any of you remember who this is. I think, maybe she's ancient history by now. When I put this together, she was actually pretty hot in the media. This was a couple years ago when I first put this presentation together. But anyway, so she takes this quote, right, and she takes this image, which we just looked at here in the upper right, and she tweets about it. And so this thing says, Cyrus tweeted quotes from Lawrence Krauss, which essentially proclaim that humans are all stardust created from atoms of many stars that exploded in the universe. Well, that's at odds with Christian teachings that God created everything in his image and likeness. It's certainly a controversial theory for those with Christian beliefs. No, right? I mean, there's no connection there between whether or not Christianity is true and that we all came from stardust. It doesn't make any sense, right? But what happens is that you get people like Lawrence Krauss who isn't necessarily schooled in philosophy. And he says these things that he thinks they're going to be like zingers to like defeat Christianity. And then you have people in the popular media who agree and say, hey, look, this is what Lawrence Krauss says. This is a real problem for Christians. Anyway, sorry, that was kind of too juicy to pass up. Yes, Katie?
Do you know when she quoted that, if she included the last part where it said, forget Jesus, might that be what they're responding to?
So the idea of forget Jesus is perhaps. Yeah, perhaps maybe that's what but I think what she actually tweeted was specifically this image here.
Okay.
I'm not sure, and I didn't go wading into her 2012 Twitter feed to find it, or whenever it was. But, okay. All right, but there's no dilemma here, right? So from Krauss's quote, it sounds like he's saying that since our atoms came from the stars that exploded in the past, God does not exist. This is, of course, a non sequitur, right? This is an informal logical fallacy. Although in his defense, it may be taken out of context, but I don't think it is because he says things like forget Jesus. And I mean, he's a pretty militant atheist, right? So this suffers from something called the hidden premise problem. I don't want to get into it, but basically if you don't have premise 1, then you can't connect 2 and 3. Anyway, I want to go, like I said, pretty fast through this part. So, but the hidden message is still powerful, right? So it's still going to influence people, especially if you're like a teeny bopper who loves Miley Cyrus and there she posts this image, right? But if naturalism is true, we are right to conclude... Wait, what's that? What are you laughing about?
Teeny bopper?
Yeah, you never heard that before?
I've heard it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Is it because you like Miley Cyrus and you're offended?
People over 70.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So anyway, on naturalism, we actually are right to conclude that what this message implies, which is that we're just an accident, right? And by the way, if you say, hey, the universe is an accident, if you don't think God exists, then some people might be upset about the negative connotations of that. So it's better to say unplanned, right? So to not ruffle feathers. Anyway, but the idea is that if naturalism is true, then Krauss is right. But he's trying to use this to prove that naturalism is true, and that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so another implication of the idea that there's no God is that the universe is a brute fact, right? If there's no creator, then the universe literally did come from nothing, or the universe has always been here, right? So we know from science, and also this fits with philosophy, that the universe had a beginning, right? So here's kind of an image of, the standard image of what the diameter of the universe looks like after the Big Bang, right? So here's our cosmic singularity, here's inflation, and then you have kind of expansion over the rest of the cosmic history. And the idea is that if you can trace back time, you eventually reach a boundary point in time. But there's something called the B theory of time, which says that there is no past, present, or future. All time is just like a dimension of space. And so if somehow we could stand outside of time, we could see our entire universe depicted as like a gigantic loaf of bread, where one axis of the loaf of bread would be time, and it just all sits there eternally, right? It's not, it doesn't have a beginning. It has a front edge in one of its dimensions, for example. And so when we draw the universe that kind of in this drawing that looks like this, you can perceive this whole drawing all at once. You can look at it and you can see that drawing. You don't have to look at it slice by slice, like over time. And so that's the idea of the B theory of time. So all time exists eternally and presently, and it coexists. It's kind of like one end of this room exists in the same way as the other end of the room, simultaneously. There's no, it's not like when you walk from one end of the room to the other, the part of the room that you left disappears and doesn't exist anymore. So that's the B theory of time. And if that's true, then the universe is eternal in some sense, and there's actually no beginning point of time. It's kind of like, you have sort of a front edge of time, but there's no beginning point. I got these two images from this atheistic website here that was trying to make this point, right? Okay, but what that means is the universe just exists. It wasn't created. There was no creator. It wasn't designed. There was no designer. It didn't come from anything. It just is there, right? I mean, it seems like, so there's no explanation for why the universe, or whatever the entirety of the world is, there's no explanation for why that exists. So I want you guys, well, maybe not. I think we want to discuss, skip this discussion. But typically we would discuss problems with this if we had enough time. So one problem that I can think of off the top of my head is, this is kind of like blind faith. This is kind of like saying, just accept that the universe just is, right? There's no explanation for it. And you can say, well, why would the universe exist? And the answer is, well, just accept it. I mean, that's no better than just saying, well, the Bible says so, right? There's no philosophical reason to accept that the universe just exists as a brute fact. Yeah.
I also feel like if there was an eternity, like of time before this, how do we get to this like exact moment in time?
It's not that there's an eternity of time before this. Time is one of the dimensions of this space-time block that you see here, and it has a front edge. But since it always exists, and the past is equally real as the present, as equally real as the future, and time doesn't actually pass, our just perception of it does, then this universe just sits there, and it has always been, and it just exists as a brute fact. It's a very weird way of looking at time, but this is what a lot of people want to claim is true, coming from the naturalistic standpoint. And they'll say things like, well, the B theory of time is more accepted by physicists, so therefore you should accept it, right? But it's not proven by any means by any of the scientific theories.
It's called the what theory?
The B theory, B as in the letter B. It's also called the tenseless theory of time, because there's no past, present, or future that is truly real in any sense of the word. And the common theory of time, which everyone experiences in their own everyday life, that's called the A theory of time, like the letter A. So I don't know who gave it those names. It's just that's what it's called. Yeah, Hunter? No? Okay. All right, so the universe is a brute fact. All right, so the universe was not planned or designed. It came from nothing. And also, you have this problem with fine-tuning. Because if you look at the world and study the world, and we've talked about this in here in other meetings, is that the universe appears to be fine-tuned, right? So it looks like if any of the cosmic parameters or initial conditions of the universe were changed in any sort of way, then life would be impossible, right? Well, what a lot of naturalists will say, they won't deny that fact. What they'll say is there are actually an infinite number of universes out there. And if there are an infinite number of universes out there, then we just happen to be lucky and live in the one where life is possible. Now, I don't want to, okay, so here are a couple quotes about fine-tuning. So from Fred Hoyle basically says it looks like the universe was fine-tuned. He even says the numbers that you calculate from the facts seem so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Paul Davies, so these guys are not theists, by the way. Paul Davies says, there is for me powerful evidence that there seems to be something going on behind it all. It seems as though someone has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. Note how he says somebody, like a person, or someone with a will.
But he's not a theist.
He's not a theist, right? So the philosophical motivation for coming up with this idea of these infinite universes is to defeat this fine-tuning. So a guy named Carl, I can't remember what his last name was, not Carl Sagan. Carr is his last name. So he says, physicists don't like coincidences. They even like less the notion that life is somehow central to the universe. Short of invoking a creator, many physicists see only one explanation, a multiverse. It doesn't qualify as a scientific theory, because it can't be proved or disproved. But like it or not, the multiverse may well be the only viable non-religious explanation for this fine-tuning problem. So if you don't want a creator, if you don't want a God, you better have a multiverse, right? So this is one of the implications of naturalism. If there's no God, and we see fine-tuning out there, we know there has to be a multiverse, essentially. Now, we talked about the multiverse last December. And it's actually on YouTube, so if you want to go back and see the discussion we had about it, it's on there. But basically, one of the implications of the multiverse we found out is that it's more rational. If you think that there are an infinite number of universes out there that explain why our universe is fine-tuned, then it's more rational to believe that you are just a brain, and everything that you see around you is an illusion. So it seems to me that any worldview that kind of forces you into that kind of conclusion, that raises a big red flag about that worldview that you have to hold. Yes, or that you want to hold.
So where does the multiverse theory force you into essentially the matrix theory?
Yes, it does.
And why is that?
It's a fairly long explanation, and I would point you to that YouTube video.
Okay.
That let's see if I can do it quickly. So the fine-tuning of this universe is so vast that it would be more likely that just the solar system would just pop into existence out of this multiverse. And everything that we see outside of our solar system is an illusion. That is more likely than this universe, as a real universe, pops into existence, according to the fine-tuning.
Okay, so it's like a number game.
Sort of, yes. And it's even more likely that just you exist, and that you're just a brain, and that everything that you see around you is an illusion. And furthermore, that you started to exist just 2 seconds ago with all your memories intact. That's more likely than this universe actually really existing.
Wow.
So, and that's why it's more likely that you're just a brain. Okay, so just to summarize, everything came from nothing on naturalism, and we're an unplanned accident with no purpose. There are an infinite number of universes out there, just like ours, and everything we observe is just an illusion, including this talk right here that I'm having with you. And any theory of the multiverse is also an illusion. And anyone that you run into that says the multiverse exists, they're an illusion too. And that you're just a brain, right? So this is what comes out of naturalism. And you're kind of forced to go down this path. Okay, so what about where we're going, right? So that was where we came from. Where are we going? So in the naturalist universe, there's no purpose. And any meaning, hope, purpose, or destiny is fleeting, right? There's no such thing as meaning, hope, purpose, or destiny that's eternal, if naturalism is true, right? By the way, our universe's expansion is accelerating. I don't know if you guys knew that. The universe is expanding, but it's not just expanding, it's getting faster in its expansion. So one day we will no longer be able to see the other galaxies because we'll be expanding so fast that the light from other galaxies would not be able to catch up to us. And eventually there will be no usable energy left to perform work, because that's the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is just running down. And this is the end of all consciousness, because everyone will die. The end. Right? So that's what naturalism entails. So this is another quote from Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing. In 5 billion years, the expansion of the universe will have progressed to the point where all other galaxies will have receded beyond our detection. Indeed, they will be receding faster than the speed of light, so detection will be impossible. Future civilizations will discover science and all its laws and never know about other galaxies or the cosmic background radiation. That's something that we can measure that has proven to us that the universe had a beginning. They will inevitably come to the wrong conclusion about the universe. So we live, this is his conclusion, right? We live in a special time, the only time where we can observationally verify that we live in a special time. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, right. Okay. In addition to that, there certainly can be no afterlife, right? So this is why I wanted to check the volume earlier and play this YouTube video. So this is a video, I think it's a clip from Ben Stein's movie Expelled, right? So he has an interview with an evolutionist and atheist named Will Provine, who used to be a Christian.
No God, no life after death, no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no human free will. So all deeply connected to an evolutionary perspective. You're here today and you're gone tomorrow, and that's all there is to it.
Dr. Will Provine, professor of the history of biology at Cornell University, gave us another disturbing glimpse into where Darwinism can lead.
Oh, I was a Christian, but I never heard anything about evolution because it was illegal to teach it in Tennessee.
Dr. Provine's first biology professor changed all that.
He started talking about evolution as if it had no design in it whatsoever. And I came up to him and I said, you left out the most important part. And he said, if you feel the same way at the end of one quarter, I want you to stand up in front of the students in this class and tell them this deep black in evolution. And I read that book so carefully, I could find no sign of there being any design whatsoever in evolution. And I immediately began to doubt the existence of the deity. But it starts by giving up an active deity. Then it gives up the hope that there's any life after death. When you give those two up, the rest of it follows fairly easily. You give up the hope that there's an imminent morality. And finally, there's no human free will. If you believe in evolution, you can hope for the being in free will. There's no hope whatsoever of there being any deep meaning. We live, we die, and we're gone. We're absolutely gone.
So that was inspiring. Okay, so the reason why I put that up there, and I wanted to show you that, was not to be depressing, but you've noticed I've used quotes from atheists, from Lawrence Krauss, now from Will Provine. I've used Fred Hoyle and Paul Davies. So I'm not making stuff up. I'm not trying to distort the worldview of naturalism so it makes it less palatable, so that it makes me feel better about my Christianity, right? These are the actual implications of naturalism. By the way, in the video, what they were talking about was that this was the natural implication of Darwinism. I think that's completely erroneous, right? Because a lot of people, Will Provine himself, the professor that he was talking about that he had, they conflate Darwinism with naturalism. They're not the same thing, right? But everything that he said there, I think, would be it would be better to say this is an implication of naturalism, right? But what he thought was that Darwinism implied naturalism, so that's why he was saying all of those things. All right. So here's the quote that he said there at the end. So it starts by giving up an active deity, blah blah blah. Okay. So what is in here that we were just talking about? Well, you give up hope there's life after death, right? So there's no afterlife. There's no hope whatsoever of there being any deep meaning in life. That's another thing that we said, that naturalism, there's no meaning. There's no hope, meaning, purpose, or destiny. There's no afterlife. But what else did he say that we haven't gotten to yet? He said, you give up hope of morality. No morality. No free will. That's pretty tough to swallow, right? So to move on to the next section, which is the one that I think is most interesting, is who are we if there is no naturalism? Right? So there's no objective morality. There's no evil. Maybe that's a good thing, right? But there's no good. That's why there's no evil. There's no free will. No rationality or thoughts. Just kind of weird to think about that, right? And I'm not making this stuff up, right? I'm not just saying, hey, you naturalists, and then like elbowing people. You guys should believe there's no free will or no thoughts. Like these are actual implications of naturalism. There's no grounds for belief in anything. And there's no justice. Okay, so let's unpack some of these things. So there's no objective morality. I think that's pretty obviously true, right? I think did we cover the moral argument last semester? I think we did. I think we had a guest speaker, Dr. Neil Shenby, in here to talk about the morality, the moral argument, right? So the moral argument basically goes like this. If God doesn't exist, objective morality doesn't exist. That's premise one. Premise two, but objective morality does exist. Therefore, God exists. It's a tight syllogism. If premise 1 and 2 are held, then you have to accept the conclusion logically. So what you want to do if you are a naturalist is you want to deny objective morality. This is a strict implication of naturalism. So there's no objective morality, right? So you have guys who don't like that idea, who are naturalists, but they don't like the idea there's no objective morality. So they want to find some way that they can ground morality somehow in something, right? So Michael Shermer says, well, we're a social species. Morals evolve for the benefit of all society. And so even though there's no transcendent objective morality that's actually true and exists, at least all of humanity is bound by these rules of morality that all are instinctively ingrained into us through evolution. But what evidence is there of that, right? That's just like a evolutionary explanation, a speculation about trying to explain why we're more moral creatures, right? Well, Sam Harris, he likes the idea of objective morality. He wants there to be objective morality. So he says, you know what? We all want to maximize human flourishing. And if we maximize human flourishing, and we accept that as a premise, then there is an objective morality that follows from it. When he says that, it's a little bit tricky, right? Because when he says objective morality, he doesn't mean what philosophers and Christians mean by objective morality. He means that as long as you accept this as an object of the game which we play, then the moral rules follow from it. So it's kind of like when you play chess. When you play chess, and this is a demonstration, or an analogy he uses in his book, The Moral Landscape. He says when you play chess, there are good moves and there are bad moves. Generally, it's bad to just sacrifice your queen for no reason. And the reason why that's bad is because that will probably get you to lose the game. And you lose the game when the other person captures your king, right? So there's an objective to the game, right? There's an object to the game. What's the object of the game? Capture the other person's king before they capture yours, right? That's the object of the game. So if there's an objective in the game, then you can define what are good moves and bad moves. So what he wants to do is he wants to say the same thing about morality. He wants to say that morality, there is an object to this game of life, and that is to maximize human flourishing. And if that's the object of this game, then there are good moves and there are bad moves with relation to that object. And so if you murder someone, that is going against the object of the game, and so that's a bad move, right? Or it's wrong or evil or bad in a moral sense. So he wants to move from something that is maybe scientifically or rationally good or bad towards the object of the game and move that into moral language. If you help people who are in need, that maximizes human flourishing. So that's a good move. So you've done something good, right? So that's his point, right? But what grounds this, right? So his object of the game comes out of thin air. If we're just an unplanned species made of stardust in a universe that came from nothing with no hope, purpose, or destiny, what makes humans special that causes us to believe that maximizing human flourishing is a good thing? Is the grounds for morality? Yes?
At this point, could you potentially then say that like rape and adultery are great because you
Okay, so the question is, on this maxim that maximizing human flourishing is the grounds for all morality, could you say that rape and, what do you say, rape and adultery are good because they give you more children, right? But he's not talking about evolution here, which is like survival and passing on your genes to the next generation. He's talking about maximizing human flourishing. So if you do harm to someone, that diminishes their flourishing.
Okay, so he means psychological.
Yeah. So he spends a long time in his book talking about what is the good life and what is the bad life, and we can actually distinguish between those two, right? So you would rather be a doctor with a penthouse in Manhattan who spends all of his or her time helping people than being a woman running for her life from rapists in the jungles of Africa who has always lived in poverty, right? And if you don't say there's any difference between those two scenarios, then he says you're crazy. Since there is a difference between those two, there's probably a gradation between those two, like different levels, and so there is something called human flourishing, and we should maximize it. So, yes, Katie.
Would he claim to be a relativist then?
Would he claim to be a relativist? He thinks that morality is objective, but objective in relation to this maxim. So as long as you hold to this as your basic premise, then morality is objective and scientifically provable. Yes, objective to a point. Right. Right. Well, no, that's exactly true, right? So he's a relativist in that there's no reason, no transcendent reason to use this as the grounding for morality. But he thinks that any other grounding for morality that you could put forth would be less good than his. But he doesn't say how less good, what that means, right? So it's hard. It's hard, right? But I mean, in his defense, Christians also have to ground their morality in something, right? There also has to be a stopping point for Christians. That just happens to be the nature of God for us, right? Another question?
Why is rape not psychologically flourishing to humanity?
Why is rape not psychologically flourishing to humanity? Okay, so I'll stop you right there. His model is not that human flourishing is based on evolution. And even if it were, you can argue from, I've actually debated someone about this, you can argue from the equations of game theory that following these other rules maximizes human flourishing better in some way than what your basic instincts that may have come from evolution would tell you, right? And because we're a social species and we evolve from as a social species, which is what Michael Shermer would say, then we do have these morals that benefit all society. So maybe you could rape someone and that would increase your survivability or your gene survivability, quote unquote, from an evolutionary standpoint. But we evolved as a society, and society benefits more. So all of human flourishing is maximized if we stay away from those kinds of behaviors. So it may seem counterintuitive, but the common thinking about how our morals evolved is not looking at it on the basis of a single individual trying to pass on his or her genes to the next generation, but society as a whole trying to march through this evolutionary process together. Okay, good. All right, so also there's pragmatism, which would say, let's ask the victim if the crime was wrong. So if the question is whether rape is good or bad, you just ask the person who was raped, did you like it? Okay, but there's no objective morality, right? So these are different ways that you can hold to some kind of morality. And by the way, this is a good one. How do you determine who is the victim? I don't really know how to answer that question. Let's keep going. Okay, so, but even Sam Harris, as we pointed out, Sam Harris does not actually believe in objective morality. So what he says in his book, and a lot of people miss this, he says, I am certainly not claiming that moral truths exist independent of the experience of conscious beings, or that certain actions are intrinsically wrong. So he's not claiming that. He's not claiming that there's an actual transcendent moral code that's intrinsic to the universe. He's not claiming that the actual act of rape has associated with it indelibly a wrongness about it. It's just that it just happens to not maximize human flourishing. And so that's why it's wrong. Right? So as a Christian, we would say murder is wrong because it's wrong. And it's wrong. You can't separate the act of murder from the wrongness of it. And what Sam Harris would say is, no, it's not intrinsically wrong. It's wrong because it doesn't maximize human flourishing, or it decreases human flourishing. But what's interesting about that is, to me, what I don't understand is that you can end up with all sorts of really funky results that you don't anticipate, right? So one of the counterexamples is, well, what if someone came up to you and murdered you and took out your heart and your liver and your kidney and gave them to someone else? So 3 lives were saved, but yours was not, right, at the expense of your life. So pragmatically, 3 lives being saved is better than 1 life being lost, and so you've maximized human flourishing, right? Yes?
Do you know how he feels about
Euthanasia? Eugenics or euthanasia? I don't know how he feels about that. I'm sure he thinks that if there is someone who's in pain and suffering, then assisted suicide or euthanasia would be good, because it gets rid of the suffering. I'm pretty sure he would hold that, but I don't know for sure. Eugenics, he would probably denounce eugenics because I think it's really hard to publicly say eugenics is good. So, yeah, and we had that in this country too, in this state. So, eugenics, by the way, is the practice of ensuring that people of less fitness don't have children.
I don't know if we would claim that to be more helpful for society.
Yeah.
The humanity would flourish through that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. And I think that's another tough question, right? But see, the thing about his point of view is not that he claims to know all the answers and all the implications. He just claims that if you start with the basic premise of maximizing human flourishing, then you can scientifically and objectively derive, in theory, using neuroscience especially, what are all the right moves to make. Even if we don't know those at this point, you could, in theory, derive them. So there is right and wrong, even if we don't know what it is. And, I think that's a good point. I think he's right. I think if you start with this basic premise, you can look at what are all the things that you could do and determine whether they're right or wrong, in theory. I just don't think that his premise is correct. So, you end up with all these weird things, like, murdering 1 person and taking out their organs and saving 3 people is good. So, anyway, okay, let's keep going. So there's more interesting stuff, right? There's also no evil or good, right? So if there's no morality, there's no good, and there's no evil, right? There's nothing that's really evil, right? So here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are just going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So again, I'm not just making this stuff up. This is what I think is the actual implication of naturalism, and this is what naturalists agree with as well. So there's no such thing as good or evil. Okay, fine. Remember what I said at the beginning. If there's an implication of the worldview that you hold to that becomes unlivable, that probably should raise a red flag, right? So how can Richard Dawkins say this and then turn around and judge moral character? How can he turn around and say, what God did was bad in the Old Testament, right? And how can the atheist claim there is so much evil and suffering in the world that God certainly does not exist? Because this is the problem of evil is a very difficult problem for Christians. And they say, well, there's so much evil in the world, God can't exist. Except for, by the way, if God doesn't exist, there is no evil, right? It's a really weird tension in their own arguments. Okay, but there's also no free will, right? So here's a quote from Jerry Coyne. He's an atheist, and this is from this article in the USA Today, but you can find that this is his point of view elsewhere. So you may feel like you've made choices. But by the way, also the video we watched of Will Provine, he said there's no free will, right? So he's not the only one. Sam Harris also says there's no free will. You may feel like you've made choices, but in reality, your decision to read this piece for you guys to be here tonight and listen to me. And whether you have eggs or pancakes was determined long before you were aware of it, perhaps even before you woke up today, and your, quote, will had no part in that decision. So it is with all of our choices. Not one of them results from a free and conscious decision on our part. There is no freedom of choice, no free will. And those New Year's resolutions you made? You had no choice about making them, and you'll have no choice about whether you keep them. This is very interesting, right? So where does the idea that we don't have free will come from? Well, if we're just made of molecules bouncing around, then all we're doing is obeying the laws of physics and chemistry. And so you guys just happen to have the brain physics and chemistry that made you make the, quote, decision to come here tonight and to eat pizza. But it wasn't your choice. It was just that's what your brain told you to do on the basis of the laws of physics and chemistry. And this is, he's drawing out the implication of this, right? So how would you respond to that? So let's take another active discussion break and talk about that. So how would you respond to this? Anyone want to volunteer? Yes.
Well, we talked about how, why he would try to share this view with others and convince other people, and it's already predetermined that he's going to be this way, and it's predetermined that other people are going to have their own views.
Okay.
And then how can he trust that his view is correct, and it's predetermined that he should have that view because he knows it's true.
Right. Okay. So this is a very, very good point, right? So if we have no free will, then presuming that he has a point of view, and he does, right? So he doesn't like Christianity, and he tries to convince people that Christianity is not true, right? So where does he get off on doing that? How does he justify trying to convince people because their view, they have it because not because of a choice of their own? And furthermore, and here's the kicker, his view. How does he justify his view? Right? Because he doesn't hold his view because of a choice of his own either. And so that's the real problem with all of these naturalists who hold things like there's no free will, because if they don't ever apply they hardly ever apply the implications to themselves. They only want to apply it to others, right? What's that? They don't
practice what they preach.
They don't practice what they preach, right? So it's a worldview that's not livable, right? Yes.
I mean, you could try to defend it with no, I didn't have a choice in writing this piece. It was predetermined that I was going to write this piece.
Right. So you could say that, right? So he could say, well, I was just predetermined to write this piece and to try to convince you that I'm correct, right? But then it brings up Maddie's other point, which is how does he justify to himself that anything that he believes about this is true? Because he didn't believe it on the basis of any rational thought. It was just chemistry that happened in his brain, right? And so that's the real problem with naturalism, is if you have no free will, and you don't if you on naturalism, there's no free will. If there's no free will, then how do you justify any of your beliefs? Because you didn't arrive at those beliefs rationally. And if someone tries to convince you that your beliefs are wrong, maybe you're, quote, convinced, but it's not because what they said was actually true and convinced you. You just had the chemistry to make that happen, right? So it's absolutely absurd. Okay, so because of that, there's no rationality, right? So how do we deliberate on what's correct versus incorrect? So if all of our actions, beliefs, and decisions are outputs based on what, one, the inputs we receive, and two, the programming of our nervous system, how do we trust anything? Right? We're just robots. We have an input, we have an output. So there's some sort of computer code inside us that reacts to the inputs. And how do we know what process wrote this code to ensure its accuracy? Yeah.
Do you ever know what his, how he would defend human beings' emotional state?
How we?
Looking at a fact just like a machine.
Yeah.
Our brain is like a machine. That's the emotional aspect of that.
He would probably say that evolution has programmed into us to have these reactions, and they're not rational. Well, most people think your emotional reactions aren't rational, right? But, they are determined as well, right? So, but here's the question for me. What process wrote this code to ensure its accuracy? So if you're a naturalist, you would say, well, evolution did, right? And it did a good job too, right? Because it's accurate. You have these inputs, you have the right output. And it makes sense, right? That's why it appears that we have rationality. It appears we can deliberate and make decisions because we have this quote, code written inside of us that evolved, and it's the one that caused us to be here because it survived, right? Or our ancestors survived because they had the better code, and they had the code that corresponded better to the world, to truth, right? And so that's why it's accurate. Now, there's a whole ton of problems with that line of thinking, and I can't get into them tonight. But basically, first of all, evolution doesn't ensure the accuracy of this kind of code. It doesn't ensure the correspondence of what you think and the way you react to inputs, the correspondence of that to the truth of the real world. There's no reason to believe that, because evolution basically selects for survival benefits. And if there's a survival benefit to believing something that's false, then it'll select for that, right? And evolutionists might say, yeah, but for the most part, it selects for true things. And I would say, well, how do you know that? If you know that it can select for false beliefs, how do you know that your belief in evolution was not selected for falsely? And that's the main problem, is that as long as there's anything any implication of the worldview that causes us to doubt our own minds, our own brains, the output of our own minds, then it causes us to doubt everything about what we believe. Every single thing. We can't trust a single thing because of that. Because you can't step outside of yourself. You can't step outside of yourself and say, oh, but this does correspond to reality because I'm here and I can tell. But you're still seeing things through your own mind, through your own brain, right? But in addition to that, there's no thoughts. There's not only no rationality, you aren't even thinking. There's no such thing as thoughts, right? So this guy named Alex Rosenberg, this is my favorite part of this presentation, and hopefully we'll get to it before we have to wrap up. So the meanings we think are carried by our thoughts, our words, and our actions are just sandcastles we build in the air. We can accept that brains convey this information in sounds and inscriptions that confer the illusion that there are propositions that give the content of the sentences speech and writing convey. In other words, we can accept that it looks like there's information here, right? But that all goes for the sentences, even the sentences on this paper. So this is a guy named Alex Rosenberg. He's a professor of philosophy at Duke, right? So this kind of thing would come out of Duke. And this is he's the author of The Atheist's Guide to Reality. So I think this is a quote from his book. He basically says, all of these sentences are not real thoughts. They don't actually have any meaning. They don't have any information. That includes this book itself, right? So what he's done is he's written a book that says that books don't contain any information. That's why I said not all atheists avoid applying this to themselves, right? So he is actually at least honest, right? Thinking about things can't happen at all. When consciousness convinces you that you or your mind or your brain has thoughts about things, it is wrong. So there are no thoughts. There's no meaning conveyed by any sentences. None of that is true at all, right? That goes for the sentences in this paper, right? Thinking about things can't happen at all. So this is a very important point here. Thinking about, so the word about here, thinking about things, is a very important point because there's a technical word that's associated with that word, about, and it's called intentionality, right? So philosophers will call this intentionality. And because we're all just made of molecules, then there's no, and physics and physical things, there is no such thing as intentionality, which means we cannot think about anything. Intentionality means the aboutness of something. So, for example, just like this chair here, this chair cannot be about anything. Neither can our thoughts be about anything, because our thoughts are just the firing of neurons. It's just a chemical reaction. And chemical reactions can't be about anything. This table here is not about Hawaii. It's not about, my dog. It's just a table. It's just a physical object that exists, right? All those words up there, they aren't words about anything. They aren't even words, really. They're just pixels that you see, right? If I put up a picture of, the Empire State Building, that picture would not be about the Empire State Building. That would just be pixels that are arranged in a certain arrangement that happens to match some other arrangement of molecules somewhere else on this planet, right? It's not about anything. So you can't have thoughts about anything. So you can't have thoughts, right? This is absolutely ludicrous, but this is where naturalism leads you to, inevitably. There's no way to avoid this conclusion, right? Okay? So the idea that we're thinking thoughts about anything is an illusion, including Alex Rosenberg's thoughts about the fact that thoughts are an illusion. Is absolutely nuts, but this is where it gets you, right? So how would you respond? I would like to discuss this, but I don't think we have time for this, right? So here's the question. So if these things are all illusions, what is the illusion about? Right? So William Lane Craig rightly points out this view is self-defeating. Even if the idea that our thoughts being about something is an illusion, that illusion is still about something. So how can you have an illusion if you don't have thoughts about something? It doesn't make any sense at all. This is a great quote. It really emphasizes how ridiculous this is. So in response to this, so this blogger, Tom Graffagnino, writes, "My jaw dropped. I gasped in disbelief at the sheer irrationality of his truth-denouncing proclamation. But then I thought to myself, well, perhaps somewhere in Wonderland, there is a University of Jabberwocky that offers PhDs in advanced theoretical nonsense, where the reality of truth and the truth of reality is denied, a place where deception is honored and the blind learn to lead the blind." This is great. Sadly, I'm afraid this is the kind of thinking that more and more people in the upper echelons of the intellectual community seem to be enamored with. It seems that the mark of excellence is the ability to think illogical, self-refuting thoughts, and then to proudly write a book about having them. It's actually pretty accurate, I think. So, okay. By the way, just to wrap this up, there's no grounds for belief. We already kind of talked about this a little bit. Why are humans so oriented to belief in God? Evolution selected for that. Okay, good. But this is what Darwin said in a letter to one of his comrades. "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions in a monkey's mind, if indeed there are any convictions in such a mind?" So why would we believe anything? If evolution selected for what is, to the naturalist, a false belief, why would we believe in anything? How would we have any trust that anything is true? So therefore, without free will, and without thoughts, and without grounds for belief, how can we justify that any of our decisions or beliefs are rational? It doesn't make any sense, right? But this is exactly where naturalism leads you. You have no other, there's no way to swerve to the left or the right. That's all you have. There's no justice in the world, by the way. Don't want to talk about this too much. I think it's actually a really interesting topic, especially going around this questions. How can we hold criminals accountable if it's all just in their genes, just molecules bouncing around, right? And also there's no morality, right? So you can commit a crime, but it's not bad, right? Okay. But here's the Christian worldview, right? All of these negative implications are dissipated on the Christian worldview. We're here for a purpose. We have meaning and a destiny. Our moral conscience, which we have direct access to, is grounded in a lawgiver. There is a God who gave us our conscience, and there are things that are actually truly good and truly bad, evil. So evil is a reality. In fact, there's more evil than most are willing to admit. We are rational beings made in the image of the one who grounds rationality. And justice will ultimately be served by the one who took injustice upon himself to save a lost world. So that's the Christian worldview in contrast. So any questions?